I'm reading.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name's Carol Allman Morton. I'm the executive director here at OLLI at Berkshire Community College. And now I got to look down at my cheat sheet. I'm so glad to welcome you here. Some folks came in after I made my very tactful announcement. The restrooms are through this door and to the right if you are here in person. OLLI at Berkshire Community College is offering a number of workshops, lectures, and book talks this fall. Many are free and open to the public, and they are a mix of both in-person and Zoom and hybrid like this one. I encourage you to look at our website, berkshireolli.org/events, to see the full calendar of programming. I have just a few highlights to share with you. We have a number of upcoming distinguished speaker lectures, including tomorrow night at 7 p.m., Michael Greenberg on his book, The Great Miscalculation, about the Citicorp Center in New York. November 6th at 7 p.m., Marty Barron on his book, Collision of Power. And then on November 13th, we have a double header, Buck Beeson on the history of steam power, that's on Zoom, and Neil Pilson from CBS Sports on 50 years of TV sports, that's hybrid, both here on campus and on Zoom. We also invite you to come to BCC for a free and open to the public reading, followed by a panel discussion with OLLI at BCC and Plays in Progress, presenting Benedict Arnold, A Tragedy in Two Acts, written by Stephen Somkin, who's an OLLI member, and directed by Andrew Joffe. Sorry, Andrew. That is Wednesday, November 5th at 2 p.m. here on campus. Again, our website is berkshireolli.org to see the full calendar. If you're here in person today and also are planning to attend the Aziz Hook and Tom Garrity talk at 3:30, you're welcome to walk over to the OLLI office and watch that Zoom in the classroom next door, so you don't have to rush home in order to get to that. And our speaker today, Barbara Viniar, will be selling and signing books of her copies of her book after this talk. So you're welcome to stay and talk with her and get them signed. And thank you so much for bringing them with you. For those on Zoom, you can put questions in the chat as we go, and we'll get to as many of them as you can. For those here in the room, we'll bring the mic around to you when we get to Q&A so that the folks on Zoom and everybody in the room can hear your questions. So, about our speaker. Barbara Viniar was born and raised in the Bronx, New York. She started her career as an administrator in higher education while teaching women's studies and literature part-time and writing her doctoral dissertation on women's moral development in contemporary fiction. Viniar served as president of Berkshire Community College from 1994 to 2003, where she was instrumental in the founding of BILL, for which we will be always grateful, which was, of course, the precursor to this OLLI. From 2003 to 2008, she directed the Institute for Community College Development, a national leadership program at Cornell, after which she assumed the presidency of Chesapeake College on the Eastern Shore of Maryland. After retiring in 2018, Viniar returned to the Berkshires and turned to blogging and writing daily haiku. During COVID, a chance discovery about her grandmother compelled her to imagine the story that became her debut novel, Little Bird, which was published by Sibylline Press in August 2025, and she is currently working on her second novel, but we should still encourage her to come and take OLLI classes. Welcome, Barbara Viniar.
Thank you, Carol. I have to say that if you had told me when Tom and Judy Easton walked into my office when I was president here and said, we're thinking about this lifelong learning group, and and Hank Payne at Williams said he'll support it, will you? And Hank had already called me and said, please say yes. So I said yes. I don't think anybody imagined OLLI and what it is now, and the numbers and the fact that we have so many people from all over. And I'm just really proud to have been there at the beginning. And one thing that has not changed is the intellectual curiosity and the willingness to engage of the OLLI members and the people who take courses here. And that was true from the beginning. And I remember actually getting together with dinner occasionally with the founders, and we'd be sitting on a Sunday evening and they would be dissecting the New York Times from that morning. Well, Krugman's article, he wrote a much better one in 1960, and I had not even gotten through the first section. So it's just a pleasure to still be here. And yes, Carol, I promise I will squeeze in some OLLI classes, which I started taking the minute I got back to the Berkshires. So, and the other thing, if you had asked me when Tom and Judy came to visit me, if I someday would be talking to you as someone who had published a novel, I would have said, get out of here. I didn't have the interest, I didn't have the skills. I was so busy working that it never, ever occurred to me. But here I am, and I'm just really thrilled. And I'm going to start by reading to you from the very beginning of Little Bird. This is part 1, The Journey, 1910, chapter 1. The 3 men sat around the scarred wooden table, finalizing the terms of Fega's betrothal. Papa, his cousin Charles, and the rabbi were arranging her marriage to Charles's son, Caleb, in America. They lingered over glasses of schnapps while Fega and her mother listened anxiously from the kitchen. Business is better than ever, said Charles. He enjoyed bragging about his success since leaving Russia 25 years ago, and had even changed his name from Chaim Finkelstein to Charles Fine. Our customers prefer an American name, he said. Fega looked at her mother. Was she also wondering what other changes there were? Surely Papa didn't approve, but his silence made it clear that he didn't want anything to stand in the way of their arrangement. Thanks to the changes Caleb made at the factory, we're growing every year. It won't be long before he'll be running Fine and Sons, and he's good looking too. A nice picture, Fega heard her papa say. She couldn't wait to see it for herself. Was her husband to be as handsome as his father claimed? Your boys are doing well, Charles added. I made Daniel a salesman. He can charm anyone into buying. Noah, I keep on the floor. The men look up to him there. You should be pleased. I can't wait for the family to be reunited, said Osher. It seems longer than 4 years since the boys left, and violence against the Jews is getting worse. The pogrom in Bialystok was too close for us not to worry. 70 of us died there, Charles, and even more were beaten. Some of them were children. And what they did to the women? What if we're next? Vega is 16. I must keep my family safe. This is what life has always been like for us, said the rabbi. Tsars come and go, and we suffer. Let's sign the contract and say goodnight. God willing, Fega and Caleb will be married by the end of the year. You have agreed that the Fines will pay for Fega and Asher's passage to America this summer. Osher will work for Charles until he saves enough to come back for the rest of the family. Sign here, gentlemen. Caleb is lucky to be marrying a girl who's been raised to be a traditional wife, said Charles. Modern ideas are fine for the factory, but not for the home. It's time for him to settle down. I was the lucky one when my parents chose Bluma. Fega will be a fine wife and mother, just like her, said Fega's papa. She heard the clink of glasses. L'chaim, the men proclaimed, to life. Did they even think about her, the girl whose future they had just decided? So that sets the stage for Fega's journey to America and a marriage and everything that comes after. How many of you have read the book? A lot, but I will try not to spoil it for those of you who haven't. So this is the woman who inspired the book. This is my grandmother, who I knew as Fanny, whose Yiddish name was Fega. And Fegala, the diminutive of Fega, means little bird. And I knew the title of this book almost from the day I started writing, even though the writing teacher I was working with said, no, I have another idea. I said, no, that's what this is. So my story begins with the candlesticks that were my grandmother's that I now have and I use regularly. They're silver plate and they are actually broken in one place. I have no idea why, but in the book I made something up. So the reason I got curious about the candlesticks is that I went to see a talk by an author, Susie Kaufman, from her book, Aging in Amazement. And she said, my great grandmother hides her silver candlesticks in her skirt during the long journey from Romania. And it started me thinking, I use these candlesticks all the time. I remember them from my earliest memories. I remember my grandmother lighting the Friday night candles, but I had no idea where they were from. Did she bring them from Europe, like Susie's great grandmother? Did she buy them here? So I actually took them into a jeweler because there was a little silver mark on the base. And I thought, well, maybe he could tell me where they're from. So he looked at it and he said, no. He said, but do you read Hebrew? And I said, well, I read the Hebrew letters, but I don't always know what they say. And so I took the candlesticks to a family occasion, and my brother, who does understand Hebrew, was reading it with, I think, one of my nieces. It turns out it wasn't Hebrew, it was Yiddish, but Yiddish uses Hebrew letters. And there was an inscription on the base that I had never, ever noticed. And it said, guide my daughter Fega from this day, your mother Tilla. And it was actually dated from 1910. So during COVID, I did write a little something about my grandmother, but I still had no plans to write a book. And then this happened. So I got this picture from a cousin, and I thought it was so romantic. And I said to my cousin, I don't remember our grandparents being that affectionate. And she said, that's not our grandfather. Surprise. I had actually heard, I don't remember from whom, I don't remember exactly when, that my grandmother had been married before my grandfather in order to get into the country. But whoever told the story said, oh yeah, she got married in Canada. Well, that didn't make much sense. If you could get into Canada, you could probably get here. Never thought anything of it, never asked my grandmother. But now I was really curious. So I actually hired a genealogist who specializes in Jewish genealogy. Her name is Karen Weiner, and she did a little bit of research for me about my grandmother. And I found out a few things. First of all, she gave me a map of where my grandmother was born, which is a town called Kamenets, which may actually be in Ukraine now, but it was Russia at the time. And it was not far from Bialystok, where they did have pogroms that killed lots of people and endangered many others. So that part I was able to weave into the story. The other thing the map gave me was a sense of when she started this journey, where was she leaving from, and how would she get across Europe? And I researched, the northern route by train, the southern route, because she had to get to Antwerp. And the other thing I found out is that she came over with her father. We do have those records in 1910 on the SS Lapland. You can see the picture there, which at that time was 1 year old. It had made its maiden voyage in 1909. So it was one of the newest, fastest, most elegant, if you weren't in third class, like my grandmother and her father, also known as steerage. And the other thing is that the Lapland figures later in the story of the Titanic, because the crew that got stranded here was taken back to England by the Lapland. So we also assume, and this really was a suggestion of the genealogist, that she came over for an arranged marriage. Because one thing that's on the shipping records is how much money they had. You had to have $25 to get into this country, and you had to have a place, a job, a family, and they were going to a family. And she, within a few months, was married to someone in that family. So I don't know if it's true. I made it true in the book, but that was the guess, that she came for an arranged marriage. So I decided, now I'm going to write my whole grandmother's story. I don't think I was still thinking book, but I certainly was thinking the story. I had never written fiction at all. And one of the things I needed to do was learn how to write. So one of the things during COVID, I was part of an OLLI class, Carol, I have history, called Writing Your COVID Memoir. And that group, oh, and Greta is here from that group. We sort of stuck together, and we're still writing. So that was one learning experience for me. And the other is that I actually got in touch with someone who had taught creative writing at BCC. Her name is Sonia Pilser, and she became my first sort of teacher writing coach. I went to a writing residency in Mexico, and then toward the end, I hired a woman named Diane O'Connell as what's called a developmental editor, not a copy editor, but somebody who works with you to develop the story. And she was going to offer a course here in the Berkshires, and it didn't go. So she and I worked one-on-one. And one of the things that I put up on my whiteboard was a whole list of quotes from Una Diaz, who wrote the book Trust, and described the kinds of conflict. And every teacher I worked with said, there has to be conflict. There has to be conflict in every scene that you're writing. And he described different kinds of conflict. There's internal conflict, where you're having that conversation with yourself. Am I really going to have that extra cookie or not? That's my favorite internal conflict. Interpersonal, Mom, I can wear this, everybody else is. Extra personal, your sense of self versus society. And then the one that really stuck with me was immigrant conflict. And I have to say that when I wrote the book, I didn't think about that as a major theme. I did certainly think about it as part of the story. And then after it was published, when you publish a book, they give it a category: women's fiction, historical fiction, immigrant fiction. And it turns out that that has been the category where it's always been at the top of the list or near the top on Amazon. So I realized that this was so important to what I was writing. And I want to read you another example of the immigrant conflict in the book. This takes place, Fega has just been on a picnic with her betrothed. And while they're on this picnic, he tells her she has to learn English right away. And he says to her, I've changed your name. So you're not going to be Fega anymore. You're going to be Fanny, because that's more American. And by the way, there's this wonderful actress named Fanny Brice, but you're much prettier. So he tells her that on the picnic. She's not happy. Now they're at a family dinner. Is this more of the cake you made? Caleb asked when Fega brought out dessert. Fanny made a cake just like Mama's for our picnic, he told the others. It was delicious. Fanny? Who is this Fanny? Asked her father. That's Fega's new name, Caleb answered. So she'll be more American. She needs a new name to be American? Fega is the name her mother and I gave her when she was born, after my grandmother, her great-grandmother. May her memory be for a blessing. The Shabbos after she was born, I was called to the Torah and announced her name to the congregation. Osher looked toward Fega, waiting for her to say something. She was silent, but Caleb responded quickly. I mean, no disrespect, Osher, but that name is from the old country, and Fanny is in America now. When she's my wife, she'll be with people who've lived here a long time and speak only English. They would know as soon as they heard her name that she had just come off the boat. And what's so terrible about that? Everyone in America came off some boat and needed time to learn new ways. It is a shanda what you're doing, he said, his voice raised in anger. A shame. Papa, please. Fega tried to placate him. Let's not argue at the dinner table. Without answering her, he rose so abruptly he nearly knocked over his chair. and turned to leave the room. I'm no longer hungry. Please, forgive me, everyone. Wait, Papa. She stood up to go after him. Caleb reached out to stop her, but she shook him off. Papa, let's talk for a minute. She took his arm and led him into the parlor. You'll go along with this terrible idea, he said. Sit, Papa, sit. Don't you see? I'm going to be Caleb's wife. I don't like it either, my new name. But I must abide by his decision if I'm going to be the wife you and Mama taught me to be. Isn't that why Cousin Charles wanted this match? Because he knew I'd be a traditional wife? Please understand, and don't be angry, Papa. I'll always be your Fagala. No, not my Fagala anymore. Now, you're Caleb's Fanny. So I think this is a good example of what happens to any immigrant family that comes to this country, and there's a process of assimilation or not, and there's parent-child conflict, and there's other conflicts in this book about choosing one's spouse as opposed to having the parents choose. I will say that I wrote that book before trad wife became a thing, and that's not what I meant. But Fanny Vega was raised to be a traditional wife who would bow to the authority of her husband. And growing up, and even as she journeyed here in the novel, her thought was, this is what it means to be a good wife. That will change. And another author that I put up on my whiteboard was Amos Oz, A Tale of Love from A Tale of Love and Darkness. And he said he wrote out or thought out all of his characters and knew everything from the character's perspective. What would I feel? What would I think? What would I want? What would I be ashamed of? What, for example, would I hope no one in the world should know about me? What would I wear? What would I eat? And so, as an author, I had to figure all of that out for every character. Why did they do what they did? I will say, and I'll talk about this a little more later, that the hardest person to write about was Caleb. That trying to figure out why he was, and for those of you who haven't read it, Caleb is the man she marries that's arranged, and it doesn't work out. And so if there is a villain in the story, it's Caleb, but trying to think of his childhood and where he came from, that was a real challenge. And one thing I did, I actually developed family trees that went back more generations than show up in the book. So even Fanny's father and Caleb's mother are cousins, and I was trying to think of what did they mean to each other. And so I had the whole family tree that showed who died and why she was like a big sister to him. So I went back more generations. So one question I get asked all the time is, what kind of research did you do? So this is my whiteboard. Some novelists write everything, they put it up on a wall. I had too many things on my wall already, so I went and got a whiteboard. And I did my research, I would say, on a need to know basis. I didn't do it before I started writing the book, other than having the genealogist. I did it as I was writing. And one of the things I would think about, there are a lot of family dinners in this book. That's what people do, right? Families get together at dinner and they talk. And so if they were talking about something, I'd actually go and look up the newspapers for that particular time and say, what was going on in the world? You know, whether it was the Triangle shirt factory or the Titanic, which, as I mentioned, because of the Lapland, figures in it. So I looked at newspaper articles. I researched as I was thinking about the journey across Europe, and I found out that the German Jews in Berlin, and this is a scene in the book, they did run hostels for the Jews making that journey. And they were eager to provide and also eager for the Jews to leave because the German Jews thought they had it really good in Germany, and they did. They were professionals, they were wealthy, they were well respected, and they did not want the Jews from Eastern Europe, who they regarded as less literate and less worldly, they didn't want them to stay. So it was like, okay, we'll feed you, goodbye. And also there had been cholera in Russia. And so there is a scene in the book where, because of that fear, the Germans had a practice to make sure that the people still on the train were clean and acceptable. So I researched that. When they got to New York, I researched who would have had a telephone, when was the subway built. And here, growing up in the Bronx, as Carol told you, was kind of an example. It was a head start for me because I kind of knew where the subways went, or I even knew that if you lived on 119th Street and you wanted to go north, this is how you would do it. So I knew which direction you would turn when you got to the end of the street. But there was so much I didn't know about that era. I actually put up on the whiteboard the calendar for every year in this novel. So from 1910 through 1917, because I had to look up holidays, for example, and say, okay, when was the holiday in that particular year, especially Jewish holidays, because we have a different calendar. And then I would also look up the weather. So if I said, let's go for a walk because the dogwoods are in bloom, I had to look up and say, okay, Passover that year was in April. Would the dogwoods have been in bloom? You might never notice, but I felt that that had to be entirely accurate. And I remember once I was watching an author, it was during COVID, and it was a Zoom talk, a webinar. And the author said that you have to get the historical facts right or the reader won't trust you. And that kind of stuck in my mind, that just in case you looked up whether or not the dogwoods were in bloom, they were. And in fact, one of the men in our writing group said to me, I don't know about that telephone. Only 10% of the people in New York had telephones in that year. And I said, but this was a very wealthy family, and I believe they would have had a telephone. I didn't know when Labor Day started, like, what year. So when I have a scene about Labor Day, I had to make sure that happened. Cookbooks. There is a cookbook in this novel, a Yiddish cookbook written by a restaurant owner that mentions macaroni. So I put that in the book because I thought it was interesting. Fashion magazines. When Fega is getting married, I looked at fashion magazines from that era to see what did wedding gowns look like, or in general, what did clothing look like? What kind of hats did they wear? What kind of shoes did they wear? You could spend your whole life doing nothing but the research. And many authors will say that that's the danger. You can fall down that rabbit hole because it's fun to do all that kind of research, but you have to move on. The weather, I found out there was a terrible heat wave in 1911. Thousands of people in New York and New England died. And babies in the tenements died. Remember, they had no air conditioning. Only a few wealthy people had electric fans. They had been produced. And so they were trapped in this heat. People jumped into the East River. They crowded the beaches. And I think it went on for about 10 days, which made me question how we cope now. But there was, and I put that in the book. Birth control. I happened to watch a program from the Tenement Museum about birth control. I think it was on Valentine's Day one year. And so that was also the first time I used ChatGPT. And it wasn't quite as ubiquitous as it is now, but I researched birth control, and it told me all the same things that I had already found out from the Tenement Museum. And I did not use ChatGPT ever to write, only to research. And at that time, ChatGPT consolidated research in a way that now Google does and everything does, put it all together. But at that time, you either had to go to 14 different sites from Google, or you would ask ChatGPT and it would put that all together. And so I did research birth control, and ChatGPT told me the different methods. And then at the bottom it said, and all of them were illegal, and women could go to jail if they had that, if they were discovered to be using that kind of birth control, like buying a device. I researched nurses in World War I. So yes, there were women who served as nurses in World War I, but I actually changed the date, and I did that for the nurses. I did it for Fanny Brice. Yes, I looked it up. Fanny Brice did perform in the 1911 Ziegfeld Follies, and I researched who else was there. So if you read the book, all of that is accurate. However, she did not sing Secondhand Rose until much later. So that's the novelist's prerogative, is to make those kinds of changes when it makes the story better. The other thing that I changed somewhat, Henrietta Zold, who was the founder of Hadassah, which is still a thriving women's health organization, she did speak at Cooper Union, which is where Fanny's husband, who's based on my grandfather, went to school. And she did say that women were just as capable as men in fulfilling the obligations of the Jewish religion. And she specifically was talking about Kaddish, which is the prayer for the dead. And when her mother died, a male colleague offered to say Kaddish for her mother. And Henrietta Zold said, no, I'm going to do it myself. She did not say it during the speech that they went to see. She said it elsewhere, but I thought it made really good copy. So a lot of what is in this book comes from the experience of my families, not just the family I wrote about. So the embroidery, which by the way was the inspiration for the cover, that actually came from my mother's mother. This book is inspired by my father's mother. And I have a lot of this embroidery, which may not have been done by my grandmother, we think was done by a cousin in Europe. And I actually have a piece of it that's a ballerina, and it has the initials GG 1939 Poland. And I was told that that was done by a cousin in Poland who didn't survive the war. So I have, everybody in my family actually has these pieces of embroidery hanging in their homes. This is my real grandfather's bookcase and the books. And when my grandfather died, we found some of the books that I mentioned in the novel. And he actually had books, engineering books and physics books in all of the languages of the countries that he had lived in. So there were Russian and French and German, and he was a very learned man. And so and the encyclopedia that I talk about, and I say, this is not too much of a spoiler, that they give to her younger brother, I have, it's in there. I also have the sex manual, which I knew was going to be in there. So when he died, I said to my family, I am positive that Grandpa would have had a sex manual. So it was called something like Happiness in Marriage or something. But if you read it, that's really what it was. And there was a copy of Valley of the Dolls. I feel confident that my grandfather took the subway back and forth to work. And you know, well, you may not know, but there are always these booksellers outside the subway stops. And he probably just picked up this paperback. He had heard about it, had no idea what it was. Or maybe he did, because obviously I didn't know my family as well as I thought I did. But I still have the bookcase. And the one thing I want to tell you about is chocolate cake. So chocolate cake figures pretty prominently in Little Bird. And we in my family, called it Aunt Rose's chocolate cake. Then I found out it was really my mother's recipe. And people keep asking me for the recipe, and I have a recipe. I don't know if it's exactly hers. What I do know is that when we asked for it, she said it included a glass of milk. And we said, what glass? And how big is the glass? And she said, you know, the glass by the sink. And we think in the Jewish religion, on the anniversary of someone's death, you observe it, it's called a yahrzeit, and you observe it by lighting a candle. And that candle came in a glass. And at that time, there was really only one size glass. Nevertheless, one of my cousins has taken the recipe and translated it all. I have not yet tried it. When I do, I will put it out online for all the people who've requested it. But the other thing is that, so it says something like chocolate powder or chocolate something. And I said to my cousin, what do you mean? And she sent me a picture of a very high-end German chocolate powder that I use in other things that no one in my family ever would have used. I'm sure it was Nestle's cocoa. And they did have Nestle's cocoa at that time. So I drew from everything. You know, some things that I put in the book are from that era. Some things are more my own lifetime. But I think that was the fun of writing it, was when I was confronted with, I need to make this happen. I was like, oh, I'll make it happen like it really happened, or I'll totally make it up. So that was how I went about my writing. Whoops, I think I missed one. Oh, okay, nope, we're good. So another question I get asked all the time, oh, no, I got it. I get asked all the time is, how did you start? You know, did you have the whole thing outlined? Did you write it? Or did you make it up as you went along? And the answer is yes, I did both. I did start with an outline, but it changed pretty dramatically as I was writing. And in particular, the thing that changed was the end. So I did have a conversation with my grandmother at one point, and I was getting a divorce actually, and she said, why? And I said, well, there's not enough love, and I need that in my life. And she said to me, this is way before Tina Turner, what's love got to do with it? And I couldn't help thinking she was talking about herself. And yet, even though, I mean, my earliest memories are of my grandmother, I couldn't say to her, but you've been married to grandpa, you know, for 60 something years. Didn't you love him? I just kind of assumed that she didn't. And all along, I kind of planned that that's how the book was going to end, with a marriage that sort of had to happen. You know, she was a single woman in the early 20th century. She needed a husband. And it wasn't going to be love in our contemporary sense. It just was going to be, that's the way it had to happen. And I couldn't do it. I fell in love with the Fanny I created, and I felt like I wanted her to have what we fantasize about, what all the love songs are about. And I also felt I owed it to you. I felt like I don't want my readers to finish this book. And in a way, it would have had a very feminist ending, because she would have said, I'm working, I can do this. Who needs that? Couldn't do it. So I changed the entire end. And then there's Samuel. So for those of you who've read the book, actually for everybody, Samuel is a character that she meets on the ship to the United States. I did not know that Samuel existed until he said to her, where's a pretty girl like you going? I did not plan for Samuel. And I've had other authors tell me about experiences like this. And one of them I remember said, oh, my character spoke to me in the shower this morning and told me that I got it wrong. And I was like, ooh, you know. And then it happened to me. I didn't know about Samuel. He appeared. He just was there. She went to wait on the railing for her father, and he was next to her. So you can go woo, because it was a very, very strange, that was not in the outline anywhere. I didn't have any plans. And then when I was working with Sonia, she said, you have to bring Samuel back. And she sort of meant, oh, they could meet each other on a street corner. You know, they'll know what happened in each other's lives. And for those of you who haven't read it, that's not what happens. So So I did unexpectedly encounter Samuel. And the other thing that happens in this book that I didn't plan for was something that a reader told me recently. And she said, I love the way you came full circle from little bird to bird. And I said, what do you mean? And she said, well, at the beginning, she's Fagala, which means little bird in Yiddish. And then at the end, spoiler alert, she's Mrs. Vogel, and Vogel means bird in German. I didn't know that when I wrote it. In all honesty, I was looking for a name and it couldn't be mine, so it couldn't be Viniar. And I thought, oh, Vogel starts with a V, I'll call her Mrs. Vogel. And I didn't know. And I told this woman, I said, you know, Nancy, I'm going to take credit for this from now on. But I don't. I want you to know that she told me what I had done. And I honestly did not know that I had done that. But I'm happy that for Fanny, she did come full circle. So I think, there we go. So the question is, who are these people in my novel? And some of them are real, and some are sort of real. So this is a picture of my grandfather. If you ask me, describe your grandfather, I would say, well, he was a little old man. He was bald and he was hard of hearing, and he read books all the time, and he was very quiet. It's funny because I once said that to my father, and I said, you know, Dad, when my children were born, you were so playful. Our grandfather wasn't like that. And he said, oh, yes, he was. He used to get yelled at because he would turn the table on its side and make a slide for you in the living room. And I just didn't remember that. I remembered the little old bald man. But this is a picture of him that will lead you to understand why Fanny fell in love with him. And I put this grandfather in the book. And at the same time, I put in the fact that he was very well educated. My grandfather did go to Cooper Union, which is a very elite engineering school that has no tuition, but is very difficult to get into. So he did go to that. And some of the other things in the book are true. But I had one experience where I was writing about Fanny taking a piece of chocolate or a ruglach or whatever. And I thought to myself, well, that must be where I get my sweet tooth, from my grandmother. And then I realized she got it from me. I made that up. I couldn't get a sweet tooth that I made up from somebody else. So I sort of went back and forth with the truth and the things that I made up. So my grandmother did have two older brothers, one of whom I found out was a gambler, changed his name, and was exiled from the family. And I found that out after I had the genealogy report. I got in touch with some cousins who I knew existed, but I'd never really been in touch with them. And one of them, who was 86 at the time, said, oh yeah, you know, your grandmother's brother was a gambler and he changed his name. So that was true. She did have she had a younger brother and a younger sister who I knew because they stayed in New York. So I've come to say to people that Little Bird is inspired by, but not about, my family, because there's just too many other things that went into that novel. So I think we have enough time, right, for leaving for Q&A? Okay, so what's next? So it's funny because Carol gave me a little thank you gift. I didn't know if you were going to come up and present it. And that's actually what this is. That's an OLLI notebook. And it's where I've started my next novel. So I'm at the point mostly of just jotting down ideas that, of course, only come at 2 o'clock in the morning. And so I have to have this next to my bed. And I just had this idea about a struggle. Well, let me back up and say, the next book picks up where this one ends. Little Bird ends with the birth of a baby. That baby is my father. And the next book is going to be inspired by his stories. And they're almost two different sets of stories. There are the stories of him growing up in the Bronx. And as far as I could remember, I think his ambition in life was to be a gangster. And maybe when he saw that that wasn't going to happen, it was to be a ball player. And neither of those were very acceptable to my grandfather. And so you can imagine we still have the immigrant conflict, but then there's the war. And my father did serve in World War II. He was sent to England and then to Germany, and he very rarely talked about the war. In fact, I remember when I was a kid and I went to some movie and I said, "Oh, can you tell me stories about what happened to you in the war?" He said, "No." He said, "Absolutely not. It wasn't like the movies. It was nothing like the movies, and I don't want to talk about it." And only toward the end of his life, actually a little bit earlier than that, when the movie Saving Private Ryan came out, someone said to him, "Are you going to see that movie?" And he said, "Why? I know what it's like to pick up pieces of my friends in my arms." And that stuck with me. And then, later he started to talk about the horror of the war. He was not a liberator, but he did go to the camps. So he saw that. And I haven't decided yet if that is all one book, maybe two novellas. They seem to be very distinct. And I'm trying to figure out how does this hang together as a book? And unlike Little Bird, where I did the research as I needed it, this is a book where I feel like I need to do research ahead of time. I don't know what it's like to be a soldier. I don't know anything about the war. So I feel I really need to do that. I read at the Lenox Library for Banned Book Day, and the woman who was reading before me was reading from Tim O'Brien's book, The Things They Carried. And I literally could feel it. I could feel the heaviness of what they carried, or the personalities because of what they carried. And I thought, well, I haven't done that. I've written a couple of scenes, just drafted them. And the last thing that woke me up in the middle of the night was, what's his relationship to God? And how would that be different from his father's relationship, starting with a conflict and then with the experience of the war? So that's where I am. And I have to say, I love to write. So I've been spending a lot of time marketing this book. I don't like that. I love talking. I mean, I've said that to a few people, give me an audience and I'm happy, but I don't like the marketing. I like the writing, and I can't wait to get back to it. And now I am happy to take questions here, and let's see.
You'd like to bring
And
chat up on your
in the
screen?
chat, yep, I got that.
Last I checked, we didn't have any questions.
Oh,
from Zoom.
okay.
So if anyone in the room has a question,
Yeah, I don't see any. Questions? Yes. Oh, sorry.
First, is that on? Thank you for what you've said. It was really interesting. I was wondering, there was a big influenza outbreak right about, and I was wondering if that in any way played into your book, which I haven't read yet.
It didn't. I thought about it. So the book ends in 1917, and it ends with scenes about World War I. And then I thought, okay, maybe it needs to, the soldiers really were the transmitters of the flu when they came back to this country, and it was in the camps, in the military camps that it started. And I thought, well, that would be, and I was coming out of COVID, but it just didn't work. I felt like I had the right ending, and I couldn't just extend it because I wanted to write about people dying in the flu. And it probably won't be part of the next book either, because I don't want to start that way. But definitely could have been. And so interesting. I don't know, what generation any of you are. I don't ever remember any of my grandparents or people in that generation talking about the flu, and they all lived through it. I mean, they were all, well, my grandmother would have been 17, 18, she was already married, and they had to have known people who died. No one ever talked about the flu. And there aren't as many books when you think about all of the things that have happened in our lives. I've read a few really good ones, but it was, what flu epidemic? I mean, during COVID, people talked about the flu epidemic. But good question, but it just didn't fit. Just did not fit. Greta.
Wait, hold on 1 second.
Can you talk a little bit about how you wrote, how you structured your time and what the process was like?
I wish I could say I got up every morning and I wrote for 2 hours, but I did not. I wrote when I wrote. There's an author, Anne Lamott, who wrote a book called Bird by Bird, and I'm pretty sure that's the book that has what is writing about, but in chair. I could be wrong, could be somebody else. But basically, if you want to know how to succeed as a writer, you put your butt in the chair. And there were sometimes a whole week would go by and I couldn't get there. Sometimes I think I was afraid, like, but what if I can't write it? What if it's terrible? And so I didn't. And then when I sat down, it was like an explosion. I never had a problem once I was writing. I wrote more at night than during the day. And I honestly think that's a holdover from when I was writing my dissertation and I had 2 teenagers at home and they were noisy and I needed quiet. And so I didn't start writing until they were asleep. So it was kind of 11 o'clock at night, and then I would write most of the night. But so that kind of stuck with me, and I tend to write more at night. I can't say I write the same amount of time every day. So one of the things I'm doing with this book, I belong to the Straw Dog Writers Guild, and like many other organizations, okay, it's not me. Okay, like many other organizations, they have these meetups where you write together, and some are in person and some are on Zoom. And I'm actually doing a Zoom meetup on Wednesday nights at 7 o'clock. We start off by sort of chatting for a couple of minutes. We write for 45 minutes. We take a break. We say, oh, what did you write and how's it going? And then we write for another 45 minutes and then we say goodnight. And I am finding that perfect. And I may actually add some others from the Women's Fiction Writers Association because it's an obligation. They're waiting for me to be there. And I go and I write. And that's how I've been working on this. And I had an article that I had to write. And so, yeah, that works for me. There is one at the Dalton Library, and I would love to do that, but it starts earlier, dinner. I can't do it without dinner. And it, so then I'm adding 40 minutes onto the writing session to get there. So I'll stick with the Zoom. Julie?
Yeah, so it was interesting to hear about all the research that you did and going down a rabbit hole and how now you have to do the research up front for your next book. How do you transition from doing this research, breaking yourself from that, and then starting to write? When do you know that you've done enough?
When you're having too much fun, I think would be the answer. That you can't, when you have what you need to move the story forward, then I think it's a hard question to answer. I almost feel like I have to get back to sitting at my desk and tell you how it worked. But I think when you're really too immersed in the research, and you're not sitting in the chair and writing, then it's enough. And it may be different for this book. And this book, the worst research I really want to do is about the war and about like the troop movements. So if my father was in Germany, where would that have been? North, south, how close to Berlin? Again, what time of year? What was the weather like? I mean, if you're a soldier marching, that's a big deal. So I may do that research, but I need to write at the same time because otherwise, I'll be reading books about World War II and I won't get back to writing.
Is there anything on chat right now?
Oh, there's one on the chat. Okay. Somebody wants to know what advice I have for someone to get started writing a novel inspired by your family. And I would say, remember that it's inspired by, unless you're writing a more biographical, and just write and don't worry about your family. Again, I don't know what generation we're talking about. I found myself worrying about what my grandmother would think. You know, like there's some sex scenes in this book, and I thought, oh, would she be embarrassed? You know, would she be angry at me? And I was like, I made this person up. This is not my grandmother, and she would be proud that I wrote a book. And so my advice would be, get your butt in the chair and write.
There's a lot of correspondence in the book, and I wondered if any of it was based on letters that you had saved from your family. And I have another question.
Okay, well, here's my convoluted thinking. There is a letter that will be in the next book that my grandfather wrote to my father on VE Day. And for some reason, that got me started. And originally, I thought, I'm going to have the man who becomes my grandfather write love letters to my grandmother that will convince her to marry him. And it didn't work. So I didn't do it.
And my other question is, I love the book,
Thank you.
and I realized I don't know anything about Jewish holidays and all these wonderful family get-togethers. And I was wishing that there was a reference section in the back of the book that I could go to better understand, you know, what these traditions were. I was really fascinated by it. Thank you.
And I would say just nowadays, go to GPT or any of the AI and say, what is Passover? And you'll get all of that. One of the things I tried to do, and people have asked me about the Yiddish in the book, I am not a Yiddish speaker. Yiddish is what my grandparents and my parents spoke so that the children wouldn't understand. So what I tried to do with the words that are in there is always say in the sentence what it meant. So the piece I read, when her father says, it's a shanda, it's a shame. So, because I didn't want you to have to look it up. And the only ones that I left without an explanation were terms of endearment. And it's so easy to find it now because just go to Google Translate. So I think there was one more.
So I'm curious about how you found the publisher for your book. Did you have a literary agent, or how did you go about that process?
Okay. So when I was working with the last person I mentioned, Diane O'Connell, she had actually been with Random House, and she said to me, I think you have a shot at traditional publishing. Traditional publishing means you get an agent, they sell it to a publisher, and it usually refers to some of the big publishers, and there aren't that many left. And I did not want to go that way, mainly because it's so time consuming. So to get an agent, you have to write what's called a query letter, which is an art in and of itself. And everyone I spoke to said, oh yeah, I wrote 100. And it took me 1.5 years, or it took me 2.5 years. Then after you get the agent, they try and sell it to a publisher. And that could take another some period of time. And then the publisher first puts it in the queue, and that could be another 2 years. So I said, I don't want to spend all that time. So I considered self-publishing. I did not want to do that. That's a lot of work. You have to get a cover designer, a paginator, a copy editor. I didn't want to do that. So then I looked at publishers that you pay, but it's a whole package. And I was almost ready to sign with one. And I honestly don't remember how I found out about Sibylline, but they publish women authors over 50. And so, a lot of those kinds of publishers require a complete manuscript. So I sent it in and they said yes. So I'm very happy that I made that decision. I just felt I didn't want to spend the time and all the rejection that you deal with when you're looking for an agent and then they're looking for a publisher. So it worked for me. I did go buy their books first, other books, to make sure that I felt like, you know, they don't do hardcover anymore, but I just wanted to know that it was a paperback that wasn't going to fall apart. So that's how I made that decision. I think we're pretty much, I don't see anything else. There's somebody here who only wants a signed book. I'll take care of that. So it's been my pleasure. Thank you very much.